Today's story is about an illness that seemed to appear out of nowhere. At first, doctors thought they were looking at a severe lung infection, the kind of terrifying sickness that can move quietly through a community before anyone understands what it is. But then the pattern started to feel wrong. Some families were being devastated, while people living right next door were completely fine. And by the end of this episode, one ordinary detail inside those homes will completely change the way you understand where the illness was really coming from. This is The Body Files from the SCP Labs podcast. Let's get into today's story. On a warm day in 1981, a public health investigator in Spain stood inside a small family kitchen, staring at something on the counter that everyone in the house had treated as completely ordinary. There was nothing dramatic about it. It was not glowing or leaking or giving off some strange chemical smell. It looked like the kind of thing you would barely notice if you walked past it on your way to the stove. But by that point, the investigator had seen too many hospital rooms, too many terrified families, and too many patients whose lungs were failing for no clear reason. And so he looked at that ordinary thing on the counter, then looked back down at the notes in his hand, and began to understand that the thing everyone had been searching for might not be in the air at all. It might have been inside the homes the entire time. Tonight's story is called The Illness Next Door. On the morning of May 1st, 1981, a family in Spain woke up expecting an ordinary day. They lived in the orbit of Madrid, in one of those working-class communities where apartments sat close together. Families knew the sound of each other's doors, and the day moved around school, work, errands, and meals at home. Inside one apartment, a young boy had been feeling sick. At first, it did not seem like the beginning of a national disaster. It seemed like a child with a bad cough, a feverish body, and the kind of miserable, restless discomfort parents deal with all the time. His family watched him shift around, maybe pulling at his shirt, maybe trying to sit up and then lying back down again, because he could not quite get comfortable. And as the hours passed, his breathing became harder. That was the detail that changed the feeling in the room. Because a fever can be watched. A cough can be explained away. But when a child is struggling to pull air into his lungs, the house does not feel ordinary anymore. So his family took him for medical help. And when doctors first saw him, they were not looking at something with an obvious answer. He had signs that looked like a severe lung infection. His breathing was in trouble. There was a rash. It was declining in a way that made everyone around him move faster, speak more sharply, and look at the monitors more often. But even with doctors working around him, the boy died within hours. And almost immediately, that death raised a question no one could answer. What had just killed him? At first, the most reasonable explanation was infection. That made sense. A child came in with respiratory distress, symptoms around the lungs, and what looked like a frightening kind of pneumonia. Doctors had seen pneumonia before. They had seen outbreaks before. They had seen illnesses move through families, classrooms, apartment blocks, and whole towns. And so in those first hours and days, the mystery seemed like it belonged to the familiar world of germs. Maybe this was a virus. Maybe it was an unusual bacteria. Maybe it was something like Legionnaire's disease or a new form of atypical pneumonia that was spreading faster than anyone had realized. But then more people started getting sick, and the pattern did not behave. Within days, doctors were seeing more patients with the same frightening collapse. People arrived with low fevers, dry coughs, rashes, and breathing problems that seemed to come out of nowhere. Some had crushing muscle pain, the kind of deep body pain that did not feel like soreness from work or exercise. They would lie in bed with their bodies aching, trying not to move, while relatives stood nearby, wondering why a normal illness looked so wrong. And in hospital after hospital, doctors began noticing something else. The blood tests were strange. The patients had unusually high numbers of a certain type of white blood cell, the kind that can rise during allergic reactions, parasites, or immune system problems. That did not fit cleanly with ordinary pneumonia. But the lungs were still involved. The chest scans looked bad. The patients were still gasping for air. So doctors were stuck with a disease that looked like a lung infection, but also did not act like one. And that is where the fear really began to spread. Because if this was contagious, then nobody knew how contagious it was. If it was airborne, then anyone standing in a hospital corridor might be at risk. If it was in the water, then whole neighborhoods could be exposed. And if it was food, no one knew which food. By the end of the first week, hundreds of cases had been reported. Doctors who had started with one strange patient were now looking at wards full of people with similar symptoms. Families were crowding into hospitals, not just with one sick person, but sometimes with several. A mother might be sick in one bed, a child in another, and a father sitting between them, trying to remember exactly when each person first began coughing. And every time another family came in, the same question followed them through the doors. Why them? Because that was one of the strangest parts. This illness could hit several people in the same household, but then leave the neighbors untouched. It could tear through one family's kitchen table while the family next door ate dinner, went to bed, and woke up perfectly fine. That pattern made infection possible, but awkward. If a germ was moving through the air, why was it not moving more predictably from house to house? If it was spreading through schools or workplaces, why were the clusters so tightly wrapped around families? And if it was something inside the home, then what was it? Public health officials began collecting every detail they could. They asked about where people lived, what they ate, where they shopped, who they had visited, and what they had done in the days before they became sick. They looked for common meals. They looked for contaminated water. They looked for factories, chemicals, pesticides, birds, animals, markets, and anything else that might connect one sick household to another. But the more information they gathered, the more the outbreak seemed to slip out of their hands. The disease was spreading through central and northwestern Spain. The numbers kept climbing, and the hospitals were filling with people who were not just coughing, but suffering in a way that looked like their whole bodies had been attacked. The lungs were the most obvious emergency because breathing is the thing everyone can see. But inside these patients, the disease was doing more than damaging the lungs. It was affecting blood vessels, muscles, nerves, skin, and organs. Some patients survived the first terrifying stage, only to develop new problems later. Their muscles wasted. Their skin hardened. Their nerves misfired. And some people who made it out of the hospital were not returning to the lives they had before. So the question was no longer just what was killing people quickly. It was what was poisoning the body so deeply that even survival did not always mean recovery. As the days went on, investigators started returning to the same kinds of questions again and again. What did the sick families have in common? What had they touched? What had they eaten? What had entered one home but not the home next door? And slowly they began noticing one ordinary detail that kept appearing in the homes of the sick. Cooking oil. At first, that probably did not feel like the answer. Cooking oil was everywhere. It was so normal that it almost disappeared into the background of daily life. People used it to fry food, dress vegetables, cook meals, and stretch a family budget. And in Spain, oil was not some strange new product people had only recently started using. It was part of the kitchen. But this particular oil had a story behind it that many families did not know. Some households had bought cheap oil from street sellers or traveling salesmen. It might arrive in plain containers, sometimes without the kind of label or store packaging that would make a modern customer stop and ask questions. But if you were trying to feed a family, and someone offered you what seemed like good cooking oil for less money, that was not necessarily suspicious. It was practical. It was ordinary. It was the kind of decision people made because life was expensive and dinner still had to be cooked. And that was the terrible genius of the danger. It did not enter people's homes as a poison. It entered as a bargain. As investigators compared households, the oil became harder and harder to ignore. The disease was not spreading neatly like a virus. It was appearing where certain food habits and certain purchases overlapped. Some families were devastated, while others nearby were untouched, because the difference was not the air in the street. It was what had been poured into the pan. But even then, there was a problem. Saying the oil might be involved was not the same thing as explaining why it was dangerous. Because cooking oil is supposed to be edible, it is not supposed to make lungs fill with inflammation. It is not supposed to trigger strange blood results, severe muscle pain, nerve problems, and long-term disease. So investigators had to ask a deeper question. What exactly was in this oil? Based on what investigators later established, this is how the oil became the poison. The oil had not begun its journey as ordinary olive oil. It was rapeseed oil, which is an oil made from the seeds of a plant in the mustard family. Rapeseed oil can be used safely when it is produced and sold properly for food. But the oil involved in this outbreak had passed through a much darker route. It had been intended for industrial use. And because it was not supposed to be eaten, it had been treated with a chemical called aniline to mark it and make it unsuitable for food. The point of that treatment was basically to say, this is not for your kitchen. But somewhere along the supply chain, that warning was stripped away. The industrial oil was illegally refined, tampered with, blended, and pushed into the food market as if it were safe cooking oil. And in many cases, people believed they were buying olive oil. That was the hidden detail. The families were not just cooking with oil. They were cooking with a fraud. Once that became clear, the whole outbreak changed shape. The first boy's death was not the beginning of a contagious pneumonia spreading through Spain. It was one of the first visible signs of a contaminated food supply moving quietly through homes. The family clusters now made sense. A household could be hit hard because everyone was eating food cooked with the same oil. The neighbors could be fined because they bought their oil somewhere else. The strange blood results now made more sense too. This was not a normal lung infection. It was a toxic illness that pushed the immune system and blood vessels into a kind of chaos. And the deep muscle pain, the rashes, the breathing problems, the later nerve damage, and the chronic disease were all part of a body reacting to something it had never been meant to swallow. What made the case even more unsettling was that scientists could connect the outbreak to the adulterated oil, but the exact chemical mechanism was incredibly hard to pin down. The oil had been altered, refined, and mixed in ways that created a messy chemical fingerprint. Researchers would study suspicious samples for years, looking at compounds formed when aniline and oil components reacted together. But even after the outbreak was linked to the oil, the precise substance or combination of substances that caused every feature of the illness remained complicated. That meant the answer was clear enough to point to the vehicle, but not clean enough to make the science feel satisfying. And for victims, that mattered, because people were not just asking what made them sick. They were asking why no one stopped it before it reached their kitchens. In the weeks and months after the outbreak began, Spain was left dealing with the scale of what had happened. More than 20,000 people were affected. Well, over 300 people died early in the disaster, and many survivors were left with long-term illness that changed their bodies, their work, their families, and the rest of their lives. People who had once gone to work, cooked dinner, carried shopping bags, and walked their children to school now found themselves trapped inside bodies that would not behave the way they used to. Some had ongoing muscle pain. Some had weakness. Some had problems with movement, skin, nerves, or breathing. And all of it traced back to something so ordinary that almost no one would have thought to fear it. A container of oil. There was also a legal reckoning, but it did not give everyone the kind of closure they wanted. A long trial followed. Some people involved in the oil trade were convicted for importing, tampering with, or selling the oil illegally. But murder charges were dismissed because the court found that the defendants had not intended to kill or injure people. For the victims, that distinction could feel unbearable, because whether the harm was intentional or not, the result was still there in hospital beds, in funerals, and in families that never fully recovered. The outbreak became one of the worst food poisoning disasters in modern European history. But what makes it so haunting is not only the number of people affected, it is how quietly the danger entered their lives. There was no warning siren. There was no strange taste that made everyone spit out their food. There was no obvious moment when a family could say, "This is the thing that will change everything." There was just dinner. A pan on the stove, oil poured into food, and a hidden chain of decisions that began far away from the kitchen, but ended inside the bodies of ordinary people who thought they were feeding their families. A quick note about this story. It is based on real historical events, but some scene details are reconstructed for narrative clarity. This episode is not medical advice and is not a substitute for professional medical diagnosis or treatment. This is the SCP Labs podcast.